Pam Bondi showed up with a flash drive, and a few documents across from her sat a powerful federal judge, confident, calm, and convinced nothing would touch him. But minutes into the hearing, that confidence disappeared. One file changed everything. The room went silent, and what happened next forced the entire justice system to take a hard look at itself. Stay with us, because the reason behind that silence is something they never wanted you to know. You won't believe what was hidden inside a plain black flash drive. It looked ordinary, cheap even. But what Pam Bondi found on it would shake the foundation of a federal courtroom and leave an entire panel of government officials speechless. The truth behind Judge Bosberg. Secret deal would only come to light if Pam could connect every piece. And if you're watching, you'll want to stay until the very end, because the one thing no one expected is the part that changed everything. It started like any other morning. Pam stepped into her office, balancing a folder in one hand and her phone in the other. Her assistant was already at his desk, scrolling through the day's schedule. Someone dropped this off earlier. No note, no name, just this. He held up a small plastic bag. Inside was a flash drive, plain black. No markings, no label. Pam took it without a word. She'd received anonymous tips before most LED nowhere, but something about this one felt different. There was no reason to leave a drive like this unless whoever sent it wanted it to be seen back in her office. She locked the door and inserted it into her secure laptop. A single folder popped up. Bosberg case's red flags. She paused. That name, Bosberg, a federal judge, someone she'd seen around D.C. legal circles but never worked with directly. She opened the folder. Dozens of PDFs. Some looked like case summaries. Others were internal documents, some with official seals, others seemingly pulled from court databases. But one file stood out. Alterations was, or logs, LSX. It opened to a spreadsheet filled with dates, names, docket numbers, and something else changes. Edits to court records, timestamps removed, hearings, rescheduled, then vanished completely. Notes that said, dismissed, no reason, stated some documents had been accessed from the judge's account, others from accounts tied to his clerks. It didn't make sense. Judges had power, but this kind of manipulation wasn't standard. And if what she was seeing was real, someone had gone to a lot of trouble to bury it. Then came the second surprise. A document labeled Correspondence PDF. It was an email thread at the top, an address Pam didn't recognize. Then another, then a third. From inside the courthouse, Judge Bosberg initials were in the header. The subject. Line confirmed timeline coordination. And at the bottom, one line that stopped her. Cold case must be closed by Thursday. No trail. She leaned back. Her eyes locked on the screen. This wasn't just a procedural error. It was something bigger, something deliberate. Her phone buzzed. There's more. Her assistant said, "You'll want to see it in person." Downstairs on his desk was the envelope. The flash drive had come in folded between two blank pages was a printed court docket. The case had been marked closed 6 months ago, but the database said it had never officially been heard. The defendant released no explanation. Pam stared at the printout, her mind racing. If this was true, if even one of these cases had been buried on purpose, there was a pattern, one that pointed directly to Bosberg. Run background checks on everyone in that email chain quietly and duplicate everything on the drive. Secure copies, only no leaks. Her assistant nodded as she walked back to her office. Pam didn't say a word, but in her mind, the wheels were already turning. Who left her this evidence and why? Now 3 days passed. Pam hadn't slept much. The data from the flash drive had been copied, verified, and backed up to 3 separate encrypted locations. Her team was running. Silent checks on every name from the email chain. A few were easy clerks, staff attorneys, administrative assistant, but 2 names stood out immediately. One was a high-profile criminal defense attorney in D. The other, a former DOJ official now working for a private firm specializing in federal contract cases. She sat at the head of the long conference table, her legal team around her, each of them quiet. No one needed to be told the stakes. One of the junior analysts pushed a file forward. We pulled the full history on the Davis case, the one from the printout. You were right. It was never actually heard, scheduled, rescheduled, then marked closed without a hearing. The notes say dismissal was due to lack of evidence. But here's the problem. Evidence had already been submitted and accepted by the court 3 weeks earlier. Pam leaned forward. That's impossible. You don't close a case after evidence is formally logged unless something changes. Who signed off on the dismissal? Bosberg. Another team member flipped open a binder. And it's not just that case. We've got at least 6 more with similar patterns pre-trial activity. Then sudden dismissal. In most cases, the prosecution doesn't even file an objection. But when we contacted one of the prosecutors off the record, he told us he never even knew the case was closed until it was already off the books. Pam stared at the list. One name in particular made her pause. She remembered it. State versus Leon Kramer, a trafficking case. Ugly detail, solid evidence. She'd followed it briefly last year, a rare federal prosecution that seemed airtight. What happened to Kramer out on supervised release? One of the analysts replied. Then 6 months later, picked up in Florida assault with a deadly weapon. Pam's hands clenched. That's 2 defendants who should have still been in custody. Her voice was calm but sharp. Start building a timeline. I want every date, every signature, every gap. I want to know who was working in Bosberg chambers the day these cases were altered. I want surveillance footage from the courthouse if it exists. And I want it yesterday. The room moved into motion chairs, slid. Laptops opened. No one needed to be told this was real. Now she walked to the window looking out over the city. There were plenty of questionable judges. There were even a few arrogant ones. But Bosberg had always been known as careful, calculated, not flashy, not reckless. If he was involved in something like this, he hadn't done it alone, and he hadn't done it without a reason. The door opened again. Pam, there's one more thing. The email chain. We found a second copy on an internal server. It's encrypted, but the metadata shows it was accessed by someone else 2 weeks ago. Someone outside the court system who... The reply was hesitant. It's not confirmed, but the IP address is registered to a political consultancy in Arlington, one that's worked with campaigns and legal PACs, including ones tied to certain federal judges. Pam didn't respond. There was a pattern forming, not just in the cases, but in the silence surrounding them. And if she was right, the silence was intentional. It was just after midnight when Pam closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The room was dark except for the blue glow of her monitor. The more she uncovered, the deeper the hole became. She had 6 altered cases, now each one dismissed under Judge Bosberg authority, each one containing evidence that had already been submitted. Each defendant had walked free, and at least 2 had gone on to reoffend. That wasn't bad luck. It was a system breaking down from the inside. She scrolled through the latest file her team sent in an email attachment from an encrypted drive. They crashed ACT earlier that evening. It showed a thread between a legal aide in Bosberg office and an outside consultant referencing a strategic delay and a timeline adjustment for a ruling that was supposed to be issued the following week. That's not how judges talk. That's not how justice works. The phrase that stuck out the most: it'll keep things quiet until after the quarter closes quarter, as in fiscal quarter. This wasn't just about legal maneuvering. This was about money and timing and optics. She picked up her phone and made the call. There's a connection to outside influence here. She said, I want to know who funds that consultancy in Arlington. Follow the donations, super PACs, non-profits, private retainers. I don't care how far back you have to go. Follow the money. The voice on the other end agreed they knew what was at stake by morning. The first wave of pushback began. It was subtle at first. I'll mail from an old contact telling her she might be sticking her nose where it didn't belong. An email marked urgent with no subject. No body, just a link to a news article from 2 years ago that vaguely referenced a legal misstep she'd made, in office. Nothing major, just reminders by noon. A colleague in the Senate called her directly friendly, tone-polished words, but the message was clear. Be careful, Pam. Not everyone wants that judge touched. She didn't react. She simply thanked him for the call and hung up. Then she turned to her legal team and locked the door. From this point forward, nothing leaves. This room, unless I say so, no emails, no calls, no summaries. We work off physical files and encrypted drives only. They nodded. They understood. No one asked questions. The Arlington consultancy hadn't shown up in Bosberg official disclosure, but the timeline matched one of the cases dismissed under his name had been filed during a period where the consultancy had been actively lobbying the court through amicus briefs, and 2 of their clients had benefited directly from Bosberg rulings. Coincidence didn't explain it, and coincidence wasn't going to stop her. She glanced at the white board covered in names and arrows. The deeper she went, the more it looked less like a scandal and more like a system built to look clean on the outside, while decisions were quietly brokered behind the scenes, a knock at the door. Pam, you'll want to see this. Another team member stepped in with a flash drive of their own. This one contains surveillance footage from the courthouse lobby on 3 different dates, each lining up with one of the altered cases. An attorney from the Arlington firm appeared briefly speaking to one of Bosberg clerks. No handshakes, no folders, just a few words, a nod, and a departure too short for a meeting. Too subtle for coincidence, she replayed it 3 times. We need a hearing, she said. Not in 6 months. Now I'm filing a formal complaint with the Judiciary Committee by the end of the week. What if they stonewall? Then we go public. One of her team members hesitated. You really think this is going to stick? She looked up from the screen. If it doesn't, then the problem is bigger than one judge. 2 days later, a sealed envelope was hand-delivered to the Office of Judicial Conduct. Inside, it was Pam Bondi's formal complaint, 32, pages 6. Altered cases, 3 confirmed contacts between Bosberg office and a political consultancy with a known donor network, and a timeline that made it almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The complaint wasn't written to grab headlines. It was structured, like a scalpel, precise, clinical, and nearly impossible to ignore. Pam didn't attach a press release. She didn't take it to the media, not yet. She wanted the process to work. She wanted to see if the system could clean its own house, but privately, she prepared for the opposite. By the following morning, her office received an unmarked envelope. No stamp. Just dropped off inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words printed in bold type. You're about to make a mistake. Pam placed it in a folder and didn't say a word. Instead, she pressed forward a senior official at the Judiciary Committee, one she trusted, agreed to meet behind closed doors. No staff, no aides, just the 2 of them seated at a narrow table in a government building with no cameras allowed. He flipped through the folder silently. No reaction, just the sound of turning pages and the occasional underlined phrase when he finally looked up. His face was unreadable. This is heavy, he said. If what you're saying is true, it could trigger a full ethics probe, but it'll get political fast. You ready for that? Pam didn't hesitate. I didn't come here for politics. I came here because a judge is altering the law behind closed doors. He tapped the file once, then Will escalated quietly at first. As she left the building, her phone buzzed. Her team had flagged a new file that had just come through a 7th case. This one was different, unlike the others. It hadn't been dismissed early. It had been allowed to proceed, but only just enough to make it seem legitimate. The outcome was carefully worded. The defendant received a lenient sentence, but more importantly, the ruling created a precedent, one that benefited two corporations tied to Bosberg, former law clerk, now a senior counsel at the consultancy in Arlington. It was more than manipulation. It was strategy. She gathered her team that evening in a secured space. No phones, no digital records, just printed pages and sharp eyes. One analyst connected the final dot. The consultancy had signed a contract 3 months before that ruling, projecting regulatory outcomes based on anticipated court leanings. It was buried in the fine print, but it was there. They were forecasting decisions because they already knew them. That's when Pam knew. The hearing couldn't wait. The complaint would force it. And when it came, if it came, she'd need to be ready for more than questions. She'd need to be ready for silence, for deflection, and for pressure from people who didn't want the truth on record. But one thing was certain. Bosberg would have to sit across from her, and he'd have to answer on the record. Not behind closed doors, not through quiet emails, not with warnings, but face to face. The official notice arrived on a Thursday. A formal ethics hearing had been scheduled. Date 2 weeks from now. Location, Judiciary Committee, Room B, Capitol Complex. Pam read the email once, then again. It was real now. No more speculation, no more anonymous threats. The walls she'd been chipping at were about to crack on national record. The hearing wasn't a trial, but it might as well have been if a sitting federal judge was found to have knowingly manipulated outcomes. It would send shockwaves through the entire judicial system. And more importantly, it would raise questions about every case he had touched. Pam met with her team that night. The rules will be tight. She said they'll try to limit what gets brought in. They'll want to frame this as a misunderstanding and administrative oversight. But we're not walking in with accusations. We're walking in with documents. She flipped through a binder. 7 cases, 7 defendants, internal communication that never should have existed, surveillance timestamps, email headers, financial contracts, and a silent pattern. No one had the courage to speak about her chief investigator leaned forward. The consultee's co-founder just booked a flight to D.C. for the week of the hearing. His calendar's been cleared. Looks like he's preparing for damage control. Pam nodded. What about Bosberg? No public reaction, no statement. But we're hearing chatter from inside the courthouse. His clerks have been unusually quiet. One of them asked for emergency leave their closing ranks the next morning. Pam received an unexpected call, a blocked number. She answered, "You're making a mistake." The voice was calm. Male, older. No name. You think exposing this will fix something? It won't. It'll just shift the blame. People who pull strings never stand on the stage. They'll just replace them with another. Pam didn't respond. The voice continued. Ask yourself if the fallout is worth the noise you want. Just as fine, but don't expect the system to thank you for it. Click. She stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down by the end of the week. The committee released the official schedule. Press were already buzzing. Whispers had started on legal blogs. Even cable networks had picked up the scent, framing it as a rare internal probe of a respected federal judge. They didn't know what. Pam had. Not yet. She rehearsed quietly in her office that evening, flipping through her outline. She didn't want drama. She wanted precision. The truth had to speak for itself. Still, one question hovered over everything. The flash drive, she had no idea who sent it. Not a single clue, no fingerprints, no security footage, no trace. Whoever. It had stayed in the shadows, but knew exactly what to deliver, as if they wanted Bosberg exposed, but not at the cost of exposing themselves. A few days before the hearing, another envelope arrived. This time, a single new document, a transcript from a closed-door meeting. Bosberg's name appeared twice, and a sentence circled in red. Keep the Bondi situation quiet. She's not our problem, yet. Pam held the page in her hand, quiet, focused. They didn't think she was a threat. They were wrong. The hearing room was smaller than expected. No grand courtroom, no polished oak benches, just a clean, windowless chamber with 5 committee members seated at a long table, their expressions unreadable. A stenographer, settee to the side, fingers poised above the keys. Cameras were allowed, barely 2 at the back, fixed and silent. Pam walked in wearing a dark gray suit, no notes in her hand. Everything she needed was already filed and copied, sealed in folders in front of each member. Judge Bosberg entered from the opposite side. He nodded politely, as if this were a routine panel discussion and not the most serious accusation of his judicial career. He wore his robe, even though he wasn't required to symbolic, maybe, or defiant. The chairman opened the session with the usual preamble, then turned directly to Pam. You filed the ethics complaint currently under review. You may proceed with your statement. Pam stood her voice. Even thank you. What I'm about to present is not speculation. It's not based on rumors or partisan assumptions. It's based on documented patterns of judicial irregularities under Judge Bosberg. Authority, altered dockets, unexplained case dismissals, communications between his clerks and outside consultants, and a trail of decisions that appear to benefit private interests while undermining judicial neutrality. She glanced down at her binder but didn't open it. This isn't about a single bad ruling. This is about the integrity of the bench. And when the bench begins to serve something other than the law, we all lose. The room remained silent. The chairman nodded. Thank you, Miss Bondi. Judge Bosberg, your opening. Bosberg spoke slowly, carefully. I've served on the bench for over 15 years. My record has been reviewed, audited, and affirmed by peers and superiors. I've ruled on thousands of cases, and in every instance I've followed the law. Not politics, not pressure. I welcome this review. Not because I believe these allegations have merit, but because I believe in the strength of this instit. He paused, then added with emphasis. If mistakes were made, they were procedural, not ethical, and certainly not criminal. Pam sat still, eyes locked on him. The chairman looked down at his notes. We'll begin with the first docket, Irregularity Case 17204, the Davis dismissal. A screen lit up behind them. The case file appeared official court record showed it as dismissed for lack of evidence, but Pam's version showed more evidence had already been accepted 3 weeks prior. A hearing had been scheduled, then scrubbed. Pam pointed to the audit log. This was manually altered. The original hearing date was removed. The decision filed hours before the database reflected the change. No prosecutor was notified. Bosberg didn't look at the screen. The dismissal was based on available evidence at the time. There was a pause. That's not what the log says, Pam replied. Bosberg leaned forward slightly. Digital logs are prone to error. What matters is what was filed officially. Pam responded immediately, then explained why. That same day, an attorney from a consultancy with financial ties to the defendant visited your clerk's office. Bosberg didn't answer. Right away, his fingers pressed together, elbows on the table. You're drawing lines that aren't connected. Miss Bondi. Not yet, she said, but I'm about to. The room was quiet. Cameras rolled. Every word was recorded. Now Pam looked to the committee. I'd like to submit a second case file, one with identical signature behavior. The chairman nodded. Proceed as the second file appeared. Pam could see it. The shift, the energy in the room. The committee wasn't dismissing her anymore. They were listening closely. She wasn't accusing. She was proving. And for the first time, Bosberg wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the binder in front of him. The second case file hit harder than the first case. 22-731 State versus Leon Kramer. Pam read the summary clearly without commentary charges. Human trafficking, financial exploitation, interstate transport evidence, submitted surveillance footage, financial logs. 2. Direct witness statements, scheduled hearing. April 14th. Actual hearing never occurred. Case status, dismissed reason, lack of prosecutorial action. But Pam had already shown proof the prosecution filed all motions on time. They were ready for trial. The hearing had simply vanished, deleted from the calendar without a trace. Until now, Pam looked toward the committee. If you compare the logs, you'll see a distinct pattern. The case docket was altered from inside the court's server. The timestamp doesn't match the usual automated logging process. This was a manual override. One of the committee members, an older man with a reputation for rarely speaking during hearings, raised his voice and who had access to that override. Pam replied without hesitation. The judge or one of his two clerks, Judge Bosberg, sat upright. Are we really here to debate case management glitches? You're suggesting misconduct over discrepancies in calendar entries. Pam didn't flinch. I'm suggesting that two dismissed cases, both involving defendants who reoffended, were manipulated before closure, and that those manipulations were coordinated with a third-party firm, one with a clear financial interest in the outcomes. She held up the document from the consultancy projected legal outcomes. Quarter 2, printed 3 weeks before the ruling, one paragraph, stood out already highlighted for the committee expected favorable motion to dismiss outcome in case 22-731. That sentence wasn't a guess. It was a confirmation someone already knew what the ruling would be before the hearing ever took place, because the hearing never did. Pam turned back to Bosberg. Can you explain how a private firm predicted your ruling in exact detail 3 weeks before your calendar showed any update? Bosberg didn't answer. The silence was thick. The cameras were rolling, and even the stenographer paused briefly. One of the committee members interjected. Judge Bosberg, would you like to respond? Bosberg adjusted his tie slowly. I don't manage my calendar directly. I rely on my clerks. Any suggestion that I coordinate with outside consultants is unfounded and offensive. Pam stayed still. Then why haven't either of your clerks submitted statements or responded to the subpoena sent last week? He didn't respond. The chairman leaned forward. We've been informed that both clerks retained private counsel within 48 hours of this complaint being filed. Do you know why? Bosberg gave a practiced answer. I instructed them to protect their rights. The situation has become unpredictable. Pam spoke again. Quieter now. They're not protecting themselves from the system. They're protecting themselves from the truth. The room went quiet. No one moved. It was a moment. A shift. The hearing wasn't just about technical errors anymore. It had entered a different space where silence began to feel like guilt, and every answer carried weight. The chairman turned to Pam. Do you have more? Pam nodded. 2 more files. One of them is what ties this entire network together, and it's why the flash drive was sent to me in the first place. Bosberg looked up. His expression changed. It was the first time all morning he looked unsure. Pam saw it, and she knew the next file, that was the one he was hoping she'd never find. Pam placed the next folder on the committee's table. Inside was a case no one had spoken about yet. Not in the press, not in the filings, not even in the initial complaint, because this case had disappeared entirely from the system. No docket, number, no filing date, no paper trail. Only one document remained, an internal memo stamped confidential pulled from the flash drive at the top, a handwritten note. This one was buried. Pam looked at the committee. This is the only record we have of the case. A sealed proceeding removed from the public register. The defendant's name is redacted, but the memo clearly outlines a summary of the charges. Corporate espionage, violation of national security protocols, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The room tensed. Bosberg said nothing, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Pam continued. What makes this case different is the involvement of the same consultancy firm again, and one more name. A lobbyist affiliated with a tech contractor who weeks later received a major government contract. The same contract that was under investigation in the this sealed case. One of the committee members flipped through the document, eyes scanning quickly. You're saying this wasn't just interference, it was suppression. Pam nodded. The court had enough to proceed, but the case never went to hearing. It was sealed, erased, and the contractor, whose name I'll submit off record, was never questioned again. Bosberg finally broke his silence. That case was sealed for national security reasons. I followed protocol. Pam looked directly at him. Then why was the sealing order never logged in the National Registry? He answered immediately. Some orders aren't made public for security clearance reasons. You know that Pam took a slow breath, then explained why a private consultancy billed her case, Resolution Advisory Services. The same week the order was signed. Bosberg stared at her, then down at his hand. No response. The chairman leaned forward. Judge, do you deny having any communication, direct or indirect, with this firm? Bosberg hesitated. I had no direct contact. Pam didn't wait. That wasn't the question. You're under oath. Did you have any communication directly or indirectly? Bosberg, jaw tensed. Not that I recall, the chairman pressed. We have 3 confirmed meetings between your IOR clerk and members of the consultancy over a 6-month period. 2 of them occurred on courthouse grounds. One of them the same day the case was sealed. Pam turned to the committee again. The sealing order was used to hide more than names. It was used to bury responsibility. The person charged was a middleman. The real benefactor was the contractor, and the contractor's legal team was represented by the same firm that predicted multiple favorable outcomes from this court. The room fell into silence again. One committee member closed the file, folded his hands, and looked across the table. Miss Bondi, if what you're saying is true, this goes beyond ethics. This crosses into legal obstruction. Pam didn't blink. That's exactly what I'm saying. The chairman cleared his throat. We'll recess for an hour. When we return, we'll decide whether this proceeding escalates to a full judicial misconduct investigation or whether further legal referral is required. As chairs slid back and staff began to move, Bosberg remained seated, still silent. Pam turned and walked toward the exit, her pace steady. She didn't look back, but she could feel the shift. The air in the room had changed. And for the first time since this all began, the silence wasn't just about discomfort. It was about consequence. The hearing reconvened just after 2s in the afternoon. Same room, same faces, but the energy had shifted. Gone was the measured procedural tone. Now it felt like something fragile had been cracked open, and everyone knew there was no going back. The chairman cleared his throat before speaking in light of the new evidence. We're expanding the scope of this hearing. Judge Bosberg, you are no longer simply responding to an ethics complaint. You are now being formally questioned regarding potential judicial misconduct and obstruction of process. Baber didn't react, outwardly. He adjusted his posture, folded his hands, and nodded. Once Pam remained seated, her binder closed. She'd already made her case. The files were in front of the committee, the surveillance logs, the altered dockets, the sealed case, the financial trail. Now came the test. Would the judge stay silent or speak in his own defense? One of the committee members addressed him directly. You've heard the allegations the documentation provided shows repeated procedural irregularities under your court's jurisdiction. Do you dispute any of the core facts presented? Bosberg was calm. Some of the documentation is misleading, taken out of context. There are explanations, many of them that haven't been considered here. Then offer them. Now the chair